What is up, YouTube people? Eric here with Team Badman, welcoming you guys back to another edition of Bad Builds, where we discuss some of the decks and ideas that we are working on here, our thoughts behind them, and hopefully give you guys some ideas to try out some different decks of your own. Maybe, work on an idea that you guys haven't been completely comfortable with. Today, I'm talking about a deck that has been very, very near and dear to me for a while, one that I've spent a lot of time working on, and one that I finally feel comfortable with getting out there and sharing with you guys. If you guys know the videos that we have put up before, some of the match videos, or some of the stuff that I've talked about on Retro, you know there are certain decks that I really like talking about. A perfect example of that is Saiyan Empowered Trunks, which is a deck that I have a lot of fun with, especially since the Sword archetype came out and you can really kind of build the deck around that. That's been a lot of fun. Iron Man is another example of that. Red Rage Golden Freezes, that's something that Alex has worked on for a very long time. He has a lot of fun with, and we still enjoy bringing out every so often, even if it's outclassed by some other decks out there. But one that I've spent a lot of time working on, and one that I've wanted to make for a very long time, is Android 18 work. Android 18, I feel, has always had the potential to be an actually relatively strong player in the meta, whether you decide to do a mid-range build with it, or you decide to approach it through a more aggressive lens. It's especially true now in the current metagame with the turn back to heavy physical attacks, and a lot of modifiers being out there, especially with Brawly and with 13. And I think that she's got a really strong niche right now in being able to wick some of that off and just really kind of mess with those harder hitting kind of opponents, especially when their stages get lower and they're not able to deal out the amount of damage that they want to consistently. When I've been considering, building Android 18, and a lot of the ideas that I've had around, I've tried a bunch of different varieties. I've tried blue variants, I've tried orange variants, I've tried a wide different variety of them, and some of them work, some of them don't. You just have to build them differently. But the one that I've felt the most comfortable with, and I've mentioned this many times, is Black Devious 18. Now, 18 in my mind has always had a kind of a little bit of a control bent to her, particularly with her named card in Android 18's Armbreaker and the ability to end combat, which is something that Black also has in the card Black Power Up, as we all know very well as access to Blinding Energy move, which anyone can utilize, which gives her a possible 8 cards to use to escape combat at just about any time, which is absolutely great, especially nowadays with a lot of decks that like to draw into extra cards and like to utilize as much hand advantage as possible. She also has access to that in some of her MP powers. One of them, which is the Inherent Constant, that shuts off the modifiers to physical attacks, especially on the higher levels in level 3 and level 4 especially, where you can use her energy attack to completely lock an opponent out of making any kind of offensive actions for the combat. She's got, some really cool hit abilities on her attacks, but at the same time they're attacks that don't deal any damage inherently, so you want to get a little bit of a modifier in there to deal out some more damage. And while Orange can do it more consistently, and with even more power due to access to cards like Aura Drill and the Orange Adaptive Modifier, I feel like it just makes sense to put her into Devious, where I felt for a long time she could be a villain variant of Krillin if you were to build her right. But this deck, it's a little bit different than that. Originally, I tried going for a very aggressive variant, just swinging a lot of attacks, trying to get to those higher levels using Anger, and utilizing, that level 3 power when you get there to draw into some of the extra cards. It even didn't have an issue staying on level 2 where you could utilize the +1 life card modifier. But over time, it's kind of shaped into a little bit more of a mid-range deck, a little more of a variant of that. And a lot of that idea actually came from Tony Ortiz and his approach to Black Devious Raditz. The more I watched the deck work, the more I realized it had a little bit of everything. It could play the aggressive game if it needed to, could play the control-based game if it needed to. You got insight into your opponent's deck and into your opponent's hand, and you started to understand how their deck worked in real time. And that's one thing that I kind of tried to replicate here, but a little bit more tuned for the set 6 meta, which, like I mentioned before, has that very physical bent to it, and you want to kind of work around that. So, this deck, I found it to be a lot of fun. It's got a lot of different approaches to taking care of certain components of an opponent's game, getting rid of certain cards, or preventing an opponent from necessarily doing something that they want to, utilizing certain kinds of key cards or key effects. And at the same time, it also feels comfortably black. That sounds a little bit weird to say, but it feels like a Black Devious deck. And while it may not have a lot of life left, given that we've got the Frozen list kicking into place in November and you can't utilize Devious, if the Conflict Mastery is interesting enough, or if Blue Resolute ends up working out really well with it, it's an approach to the deck that you could shift between other decks and maybe even other styles and actually make work out pretty well. So instead of talking about the deck and what the deck can do, I'm just going to go ahead and dive into the actual cards that comprise the deck. Already mentioned that it's Black Devious Mastery, which, I will admit as a Devious player feels a little bit like a crutch mastery sometimes. You can put just about any MP into it and it works out really well. But like I mentioned, I feel this is a strong place for 18. She's got a little bit more of that control variation, sorry about that. And, with the mastery and being able to discard cards from your opponent's hand, utilizing it, she can kind of play around, whatever the opponent may have in hand, as long as they're not, drawing 410 billion times a turn. It adds modifiers to her attacks, which is something that you really want to utilize. But the big key to Android 18 is that you really have to leave those early levels. Level 1 is not so bad in the early game since you can prevent some of that physical damage, and you've got a relatively decent attack. If your hand's bad, you can always throw it. It doesn't cost you anything, and you can recycle your hand. Or in the case that I use it most frequently, you can actually use it as kind of the last action in a combat. Free poke for 1 life and 1 power stage, which is, it's still free damage. That doesn't work out too bad, and it does add up over the course of the game if you manage to stay on level 1. So that can work out pretty well. But the one thing that's an issue with Android 18 in my mind is her level 2. Because you have a lack of inaction, it's only a slight improvement over her level 1. And while the +1 life card modifier is nice, it's still a really, really slow spot. And I think a lot of 18 players have found that. So part of this deck is to really, really get off those early levels and get to level 3. And as you'll see, some of the card choices in here are very, very focused around that. But I'm going to go ahead and just start off in the same way that I build the decks from the top down. And I'm going to start with the physical combats, which is kind of the exact opposite of where I usually start. I usually start with setups and events, yada yada. But I just wanted to go from kind of the aggressive end down so that you can see how the deck shapes out from there. And in this meta, any black deck really has to start out with 3 copies of Black Defensive Burst. Of course, this is going to be your biggest key into shutting down a lot of the major players in the current metagame. Brawly gets hit really, really hard by this. Some of the mid-range cooler decks get shut down as well, particularly blue variants and red variants as well in the early mid-game. 13 gets hit on every level by this card, so it works out really, really well for him. And some of the other physically based players, of course, Vegeta, Gohan, Trunks, as all of those kind of shape up here into the future, you're going to see it being an exceptionally useful tool. It's still life card damage for a physical attack. If it hits, shuts off all those physicals, works out really nicely. It can potentially deal critical damage in Devious. It's an absolutely necessary card at this current point in the game. Following that up is 3 copies of Black Dismissal, which is, I think, another kind of key card right now because stages are a really, really big deal, especially in Android 18 where you want to keep your stages high enough to utilize that continuous effect to shut down all of your opponent's modifiers, especially once you leave level 1. So Dismissal is a great tool for that. Gain 4 stages, it's a 2-anger swing between raising yours 1 and lowering theirs 1. And while the damage isn't particularly great, it's not supposed to be. 5 stages in the life. In the early game can be useful, can shut down more energy-based opponents from actually utilizing their attacks. Plus, in a pinch, it has endurance too, so that's 6 extra endurance in the deck that you're going to end up running into. Worst case, if you really don't need it, you can always pitch it to the mastery, but it's a really useful tool, particularly for the stages right now, which is the main reason that it's even in the deck in the first place. And that's actually it for the styled attacks, at least the styled physical attacks that are in the deck. There aren't a whole lot, which does really feel out of place for Black Devious because you want to utilize some of those cards to pitch the mastery. But there are a lot of other cards to do that with in this deck. And there's so many good freestyle options that you're going to want to run. The first of which is, of course, Android 18's Armbreaker. There are 3 copies of it in here. It's got multiple different purposes to it. It's tech to search out with Android 18's Toss so that you can help to prolong combat. It's anger gain for you. It drains stages from your opponent. And it's a decent attack as it is. AT plus 3 is pretty solid, especially on 18's higher levels where she can, deal a pretty considerable amount of damage with it. Plus, it's a combat ender. With that hit effect, you can banish top card of life deck to get out of combat. That's a really, really big tool, especially when your opponent is gearing up for something really, really strong. Ruthless decks can really get kind of stumped by this if they don't have a block ready. Especially if they've got relaxations to pull. Brawly decks might utilize Face Crusher, or say Trunks decks might utilize some of the drill effects from like aggressive sword drill or something like that. There are a lot of ways for certain decks nowadays to really capitalize on hand disadvantage from their opponent, and being able to get out of combat is a really, really big asset to this deck, and this card's an important key to that. Next is 3 copies of Devastating Blow, which is an excellent tech card right now, and I'm surprised more decks aren't actually running it. In this case, it's not being run for damage, and it never really was. It's a 3 anger swing, lowers your opponent's anger 2, raises yours 1. The discard pile hate is the biggest part. You banish 3 cards from your opponent's discard pile. And that's one thing that Black does. Black likes to banish cards a lot. And, this is a really, really big tool, especially against cooler-oriented decks that want to try and, rejuvenate those cards using their effects and get a bunch of cards back. Ginyu decks, which have gotten really popular nowadays, can really kind of get hurt by that, especially if they've got, blue lunar rays or sobering hammers or overpowering attacks to utilize to get them out of the discard. Even if it's a tag team deck, you can banish multiple allies. You can, force them to choose what ally they want to get back at the end of the turn. It's really important tech right now. It screws over Visiting the Past. You can manipulate your opponent, red relaxations, or whatever cards it may be. It's really, really important right now. More decks should honestly be running discard hate. Next up is 3 copies of Sinister Choke. Well, we already know how good this one is, and while there may not be a whole lot of board state right now, the 20s and the Krillins of the world have kind of fallen off. It's got one really, really big asset at the moment, and that is those ally-oriented decks. As I mentioned, Captain Ginyu's come back into vogue. Brohan has been a really, really big thing right now. And being able to get a guaranteed attack through, especially one that will deal critical damage, is a really, really big deal. It's a very strong attack. The only downside to it in this deck is, it doesn't have any endurance to it, which kind of bites. It is freestyle, and there is a considerable amount of freestyle hate that's around, whether you run, surprise attack, or the Cell Ally, or they make it shut off entirely by cards like Android Defensive Blast. And that's especially going to be true in the coming sets, since the new Vegeta stack is very oriented around that freestyle stuff. But it's going to be a very, very strong player, and it's a card that completely warrants its spot. Just about any strongly oriented, sort of mid-range black deck I've seen running them. Krillin's run it. I've seen Raditz run it. 13. There are a lot of reasons to run this card, and it's really, really useful right now. And lastly, for our physical attacks, I have 2 copies of Android Armbreaker. Which I enjoy this card a lot right now because of the popularity of Unleashed. Unleashed, is such a big deal, especially for a lot of those decks that need to level very quickly and have the attached cards to do it with. And this slows them down really, really hard, especially Brawly decks. If they get stuck on level 1 with this, they've got no good way to get it off. They're just really going to end up stuck. And it makes Unleashed an almost completely dead card in their hand unless their opponent, in this case, also has NPPV shut off, which doesn't necessarily happen very often in this deck, but it is possible. But this card has a lot of utility right now. It's another card that attaches, and while it does strengthen an opponent's Unleashed, it also prevents them from utilizing the primary effect, which is to level. It's 3 endurance extra. It's flat stage damage for 6 stages. So it doesn't work out too bad. It hits relatively hard. It's relatively useful at the moment, so I can't complain about it. This deck runs 8 physical blocks, which might seem a little bit high. It's a little bit more defense-oriented because you want to kind of, tempo at certain points. But with the popularity of physical decks, it's not really much of a surprise that there are these. And Black has so many good blocks to utilize that it's really hard to just pick 1 or 2. So there's a little bit more variance here. And of course, if you're building this deck and you don't feel the block necessarily fits, you always have an option to switch with in a lot of great other physical blocks. But this deck utilizes 3 copies of Black Finger Block. Of course, you want those stages back. It's really useful. The extra endurance is nice, so it works out really well, especially with the theme of this deck being keeping those stages high. There's 3 copies of Black Delay, which is one of Black's best blocks easily. Just about no matter what happens with it, your opponent is going to lose a card from the hand, and it may not necessarily be the card they want to, but this card works especially well with those MP powers that get thrown on a lot for the physicals. Android 13 level 3 or Brawley level 3, Cooler level 2. All of those can really end up biting an opponent pretty bad, because they'll be like, oh, this won't be so bad. Then you're like, Black Delay, lose a card from hand. No complaint there. It's got extra endurance on it, which actually all the physical blocks in here do, so it works out really well. Worst case, it's a mastery pitch, and there's nothing to complain about this block. It's usually my first consideration when it comes to a black style physical block, and I certainly hope it's yours as well. And lastly, there are 2 copies of Black Knee Catch. Of course, Raise Your Anger 2. It helps kind of facilitate that move off of level 1 and even off of level 2. And that's exactly what you want, especially with some of the additional anger cards that are in this deck, which you guys will find even more of them coming up here. So next up are the energy combat cards. There's about the same amount of these as there are the physical combats, maybe a little bit less, but all of them have additional utility, and of course they all work out nicely for all of their secondary effects, which is the main reason they're in this deck in the first place. There's not necessarily any kind of beatdown oriented energies in here, but instead they're utilized for their secondary effects. Of course we start off with 3 copies of Android 18's Toss. If you're playing Android 18, it's exactly the kind of tech that you want. You play it, it replaces itself with another card in the deck that isn't 18's Toss. So you can pull out an 18's Armbreaker if you need to in order to jet out of a combat. If you know your opponent hasn't unleashed, you can pull out an Android Armbreaker. There are some other cards in here that you may be able to get out if you need them. Plus it does a decent amount of damage. With the Mastery, it's 5-1. It's relatively solid there. The only downside is it's banished after use, and this deck actually does not run Defiant Challenge. Prior variants of this deck had, but it didn't quite make its fit into here. But it's actually a really good consideration to have with 18's Toss. Throw it, get a card in hand, get it back with Defiant Challenge, then get another card in hand so you can just keep prolonging and prolonging combat. But the purpose is to get a nice tech card out with this, and there are a bunch of different options as you'll see by the end of this video. Next up is 3 copies of Android Defensive Blast, which I think is one of the most underrated cards in the game right now. It's 2 for 5, which deals a very considerable amount of damage, but the hit effect is a really big deal here. The hit effect shuts off all the immediate effects of non-styled attack cards. So this can really screw over opponents that try to utilize a lot of those. Brawly's Face Crusher gets shut off really hard. Overpowering Attack, Sobering Hammer, other named cards like Krillin's Destructo Disc, Sinister Choke. There are a lot of cards that get shut off by this. And it's going to be even more true with the coming of Awakening cards like Assist Kamehameha, Vegeta's Final Flash, Flurry of Blows. Whatever may come our way, there's going to be a lot of cards that get shut off by this. And while it shuts off your own, if you time it right, it can really mess with opponents that aren't prepared. Plus it's got endurance, which doesn't work out too bad. Swings for a decent amount of damage, and it's something else you can pull with 18's Toss, so I definitely can't complain about it. I think it's great, and if you haven't tried it, I definitely recommend it. Next up is 2 copies of Black Capture, which Black Capture is absolutely great right now. It's a little bit expensive of an attack for 3 stages, but it attaches and starts banishing cards off the top of your opponent's life deck every single turn, which if they don't have a way to get rid of it, it will just absolutely devastate throughout the course of the game. While it does make for unleashed fodder for those opponents who have them, and it can get unloaded really easily. If you time this right, utilize some of the other cards that you'll see in the deck later on, you can really mess with your opponent and get rid of some key cards, especially if they're just not prepared for it. It is a little bit of a risk because, 1, of the high stage cost, and 2, because you have to hit with it to utilize it the most. But it's still very effective right now, especially for the decks that aren't prepared. Next is 2 copies of Blinding Energy Move. Of course, the combat ender, so we know how effective this is. It's one of the extra ways to get out of combat. It still deals an alright amount of damage, 4 life and power stage in Black Devious. The caveat here and the big risk is that you have to banish your top 2, of course, and black doesn't have very good rejuvenation, which I think we all know. It really kind of sucks, it makes it risky, but it's a great way to get out of combat if ever you should need it, and it's a really clutch card in, in just the most dangerous of circumstances. And lastly is one of my favorite new energy attacks, 2 copies of Villainous Powerball. This card is just fantastic in this meta, especially with all the stage modifiers that are going around. And after, judging the Kentucky Regional, I feel like there are certain decks that almost single-handedly sold this card to a lot of mid-range and control-oriented decks. Being able to shut off 4 stages of damage from all of your opponent's attacks during combat can really mess with opponents like Brawley and 13 in the early game. Its additional anger hate lowers your opponent's anger 2, and in Devious it swings for 5 life. Considerably strong. Sure, it's banished after use, but with extra effects like this, it's certainly going to be usable. Can help save you from what could be some really dangerous combats, and it's just absolutely great tech right now. If you haven't taken a look at it, I completely recommend it. Next up is the blocks, in which, compared to the physicals, I do run less, but I still run 5 energy blocks, which is a little bit high for the current metagame. But since it's Black Devious, you can always pitch some of them to the master if you don't need them. In which case, one of them you're probably going to be doing that with, which is 3 copies of Black Corruption. Of course, this card isn't anywhere near as what it was in the heyday, being able to just discard it and banish top 2 off your opponent's life deck. It was just a really different time there, and I think we all got frustrated by it at one point. But it's still a perfectly usable card. It's the same level of anger swing as Devastating Blow, which is a 3 anger swing, very considerable. You can always discard and banish top 2 your opponent's life deck, which works well with some of the other cards in the deck. It's still completely usable, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. And lastly is 2 copies of Black Swipe. It's a kind of a Devious stalwart. Banish 3 from your opponent's discard pile, because discard hate is very important. Endurance 2 is great, still stops an energy attack. Absolutely no complaints there. Next up, I'm going to go back to where I usually start off my deck list, and that's going to be the setups, drills, and whatnot. Out of all those, I only run 4 setups entirely. I don't run any drills. And I've tried different variants. I've tried running a considerable amount of setups and drills. I've tried running very few, and I've tried even running none. But I've found with some of the card choices that are in here, keeping it relatively light and relatively flexible works out, it works out pretty well, so I don't think I can complain about it so far. There are 2 copies of Black Android Programming, which is one of those cards of Vengeance that I think kind of got overlooked. And it was a little bit of a disappointment as a black-styled Android card, considering some of the other options that other styles got. But it works out really well in this deck because of the access to banish-oriented cards. Whenever it's attached, it increases the amount of banish from your effects by 1. So if 1 is attached, your Black Capture, start banishing 2 every turn. And then Black Corruption, if you discard it, banishes 3. And while those might be the only 2 cards that actually banish in this deck, they can still swing a game relatively quickly, and they do add up over time. Of course, if you have both attached, then it's just all the more sweeter. You can just start banishing, a hand's worth of cards or more very quickly. And it'll add up over the course of the game if your opponent doesn't have any way to address it, any kind of critical damage mechanisms or anything like that. Plus, it's searchable with Android 18's Toss, which I think I might have already mentioned. But, that's just a great utility for it right there, especially with some of the other cards you'll find in the deck, which I think if you're seeing this one already, you already know exactly what I'm talking about. And the other setup is 2 copies of our last Combat Ender Black Power-Up. Of course, this just makes sense for Black style. It's a great setup and has a 2-fold purpose. 1, it gets you all of your stages back, which that's a big focus of this deck, especially in the current meta, which I've said several times now. And it's your last way out of combat. If you manage to get all of your combat enders throughout the course of a game, you can really disrupt your opponent very handily, especially if some of those banishing cards like Black Capture are already in play to really kind of mess with your opponent. One of the reasons I actually keep the setup and drill count light is because I do play Namek Dragon Ball 4 in this deck as well. And the main reason why is because they're so light, and that way I don't really have as much of a concern if Namek Dragon Ball 4 gets captured during combat. And while that's a really big risk due to the popularity of triple threat decks right now, especially red ones that can easily capture Dragon Balls that are unprotected, it's still useful in some of those kind of clutch moments to get rid of just really kind of important cards an opponent might have. Maybe they laid out a Visiting the Past or Red Relaxation, or maybe there's a Tree of Might attached or something like that. So it's relatively nice to have available. Can be just one of those clutch moments that you want to utilize. While it doesn't actually have a way back into the deck like it used to with cards like Black Declaration, it's still very usable. There's other ways of getting rid of subs with some of the other cards that remain in the deck, but this is going to be a really big tool, and it's got a little bit of a surprise factor to it, so I think it works out relatively nicely. And lastly for the deck is all of our events. There's a relatively considerable amount of events for the deck, but all of them have, they've all got their place, they've all got their use. Of course, if you're playing a black deck, you want 3 copies of Black Foreshadowing in the deck. Once again, this plays into your stages. It's extra mill off your opponent. It's Endurance 3, and while it sucks to see in the early game because you're not really going to get anything off of that, in the late game, it is an absolute savior of a deck. It's won me plenty of games, and it's one that if you're not running, you should seriously consider running, especially in Devious. Next is 2 copies of everyone's favorite love-hate card, Villainous Energy Sphere. I considered using Stare Down in this deck, and I did use it for a while. Stare Down is absolutely great. I enjoy it, but I found for kind of the mid-range focus, you want to more prevent your opponent from disrupting your hand than actually disrupting theirs, because of all the ways you've got to end combat, just really mess with your opponent in that regard. Having a sphere is going to help get rid of some of those really key events that your opponent might have, especially Saiyan cards like Saiyan Rescue, which you're just really going to want to get rid of those if you can help it. Of course, you can stop Times of Warrior's Tool, opposing hand disruption cards. There's a wide variety of stuff that you can get rid of. And I think it works a little bit better in here than Stare Down, but you really can't go wrong either way. It works out pretty well. Next is 2 copies of Tug of War. Tug of War is in here because of the popularity of allies right now, and it's really easy to find yourself faced with just an onslaught of a whole lot of allies, and there's not much you can do about them. It's 2 extra endurance per card. Plus, if you draw into it, it lowers their anger 2, still banishes an ally, and it goes right back into the life deck, so it's self-replacing. It's guaranteed to show up at some point, and it's really strong right now with the popularity of just so many different ally decks. If it continues that way into Perfection, or not Perfection, sorry, Awakening, we're just going to have to see, but for now it's a relatively strong choice, and it's one of Black's only ways to deal with allies, so it's definitely got its place. Next is 2 copies of everyone's favorite leveling card, Unleashed. And I think this is one of the really big reasons that I was excited to make 18 work so well. Because as I mentioned, 18 doesn't have really strong early levels. They work out okay, but the big sweet spot is level 3. And before, it took a lot of specific anger tech in order to get to there. Sometimes you had to run commands in this deck, or maybe you had to run dash and combo, and there were just other cards that you could use better. But Unleashed finally gets around that. With the popularity of Unleashed, sure, utilizing it, you do run the risk of getting hit by your opponent's own Unleashed and getting de-leveled. But in a lot of cases, especially with access to spheres here, it's really easy to prevent your opponent from doing so. And you just want to level so bad with this. At the moment, we do only have the 1 attached card, Black Android Programming. It's relatively easy to get rid of, considering there's only 2 copies. This is one that you really want to see in the early game so that we can just catapult yourself up early. But it can also work well as a late game closer if you've still got one of those attached cards in your life deck, or if they're actually attached still. So it's kind of the key, I think, to 18 really unlocking her potential, or I guess you say unleashing her power. Either way, whether you make funny or not, it's a really big component to this deck. And if you don't get it out, it feels a little bit a little bit slower than it has in the past, which is why some of the other anger cards are still in there. That's why you've got the knee catches, the Armbreakers, and Android Defensive Blast, and things like that. So you still can gain anger and get off of those levels, but this is the real way that you want to do it. Next up is 2 copies of Black Scout Maneuver. Of course, this is one of Black's big key cards, especially with knowing how similar a lot of meta decks are right now. It's your best call early game. Just throw it out, name a card that you know you're going to hit 3 of, completely wipe them out. The downside is it really sucks late game, and I think we all know that. Which is why I felt a little bit pensive about even using it. Black Searching Technique is just as viable of an option. It gives you insight into your opponent's deck instead. It's one that I've kind of switched back and forth on, and if you really don't like Scout Maneuver, if you try this deck out, go ahead and try out Searching Technique. I think it works out just as well. 1 copy of Black Nightmare, which is one that I unexpectedly enjoyed out of Perfection. It gives you insight into your opponent's deck. It lets you get rid of what can be some of those key setups of drills. Gives you back extra stages, and it replaces itself. I think it's a worthy one of. I don't know if I would run it at more than 1, because while it does give you insight into your opponent's deck, it's still an action that has to get taken up. It's only got 1 endurance to it, and for decks that don't actually run any board, it's not tremendously strong. Might strengthen in the future, and if that's the case, then it might warrant more than 1 spot. But one of just works out great right now. I can't complain about it one bit. And lastly, of course, is Time as a Warrior's Tool. It's the block that every deck should run, whether you utilize, cards that shut it off, like Orange Freezing Drill, or cards that bash it, like Surprise Attack, or whatever. It's still a card that is completely worth running. I don't even need to speak about it, it just speaks for itself. But that's the deck, and I've been having an absolute blast with it. I've spent so much time, tweaking this deck and improving on it, and trying to make it into something more than it feels like it should be. It feels like it's got a lot of potential to it, but it takes a lot of crafting, a lot of execution to really make 18 work. And it may not even be the best call, considering that you've got access to so many other MPs that can do the control kind of thing, and may even be able to do it better. This is one that I've been very excited about and had a lot of fun with, and I've talked about it to you guys a lot, and I really hope it's one that you guys consider checking out. Whether you play 18 in Devious, whether you play in Adaptive or Protective, or the new Resolute Mastery or new Conflict, or whatever it might be, I actually encourage you to try out 18, especially if you're looking for something that feels a little bit more like an anti-meta call right now. It can play relatively well against the meta, and while it does have its inherent weak spot stuff that's really going to struggle with, it's a lot of fun. And if everything works out right, you get your draws set up well, it can do some very considerable work, and it can actually end a lot of games in short order. So I encourage you guys to try it. But that's going to do it for this deck list. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, be sure to click that like button down below. I'd love to see your guys' thumbs up there. That'd be great. If not, click the dislike button down below, and please let me know why you guys didn't like it in the comments section. I've seen some dislikes in other videos. I would like to know an explanation as to why, so that way I can, improve on the product and I can make it better for you guys. But I can't do that without your guys' help. So if you guys didn't like it, please let me know why in the comments section so I can improve on it. Also, if you guys haven't clicked the subscribe button down below, be sure to do so. It's right down there. So that way you guys can follow these videos, this series, and all of our other series we've got going on. There's going to be a lot of stuff coming up. While we are winding down a little bit in OP season, there's a bunch of other stuff that's coming up really soon here. We've got some actual video game stuff that'll be coming up, including a new series I'm really excited to get started on. It'll be timed really well. I think you guys will really enjoy it. So be sure to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Lastly, if you guys haven't followed us on social media, all our social media links are down below. So you guys can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Twitch, and Libsyn, which for those guys who don't know, Libsyn is podcast hosting. And we will have that up here very soon. I know I've been talking about it a lot, and there's been a lot of time that's been going into other stuff. But there will be a podcast up here very soon for you guys to check out, and you guys will see it all over the place. So be sure to hit us up over there. We would love to interact with you guys. So that's going to do it for this version of Bad Builds. Thank you guys so much for watching. And like always, guys, stay bad. American T Badman signing out. Thanks for watching, guys. We'll catch you later.